Hi, I'm Adam Feinberg, and this is Harlem Stories.
And I'm Mark Becker, joining Adam.
Now, Mark has got to cut the episode a little short, so I'll just continue on when he winds up leaving.
You'd be okay without me?
Yeah, I think we'll survive, but obviously it's not going to be as entertaining. We know that for sure.
You're so sweet.
So today we're discussing part 2 of getting to know Washington Heights. So I'd like to give in a larger overview a little bit of a showcase of the housing that's available in the neighborhood, and some of the common themes that we kind of come across, or if there's larger sets of buildings that we can cross and talk about in commonality. And there are two that kind of stand out to me initially because they are larger developments. And one of them is Castle Village in Hudson Heights. Really notable. It's on the Hudson River, 7.5 acres of manicured grounds set on the highest bluff, roughly around 200 feet above sea level, above the Hudson River. It's a total of 5 buildings, and it was designed by George Fred Pelham Jr., and 8 out of 9 apartments on each floor actually have river views. So, it was actually, the complex was designed to kind of, be reminiscent of castles. But I think one of the things that I love most about Castle Village is that they put out, especially in the in probably 3 seasons out of the year, they put out Adirondack chairs on their lawns that they have, and you're overlooking the Palisades, in New Jersey, and the Hudson River, and you can just sit in these Adirondack chairs, just feel like you're almost in the country. So it's just one of the most serene and relaxing things. You've got the GW Bridge a little bit to the south, a few blocks to the south, but at the same time, it almost feels like you're removed from the city. It gives you such a different dramatic feel from anything else that you might experience in Manhattan. And you almost you feel like you're more in the country than you are in Manhattan.
Yeah.
So, it's definitely worth mentioning. It's a pretty cool co-op. I believe that the gentleman that wrote In the Heights and Hamilton, I believe his father might have been working on the grounds at Castle Village. I don't know if that's true. I've heard that as a rumor, but I believe that might actually be the fact. Another of the large complexes is actually just a little to the east of Castle Village is Hudson View Gardens in Hudson Heights. And this one was actually designed by the father of the designer of Castle Village. So this one was actually developed by George F. Pelham Sr. So father and son working in the same neighborhood, actually, and almost practically next door to each other. Hudson View Gardens, it was designed by him in the Tudor architectural style in 1924, is the oldest continuous running co-ops, owner-occupied since it's opened. Hudson View Gardens is set in beautiful gardens in an English sitting garden, private picnic terrace overlooking the river, and they even actually have a penthouse apartment available to rent for overnight guests. So, they weren't necessarily in the business of being a hotel, but, if you had guests visiting, they made it very convenient. So these are a couple of the larger developments that are worth mentioning in there. There's also, River Terrace at the toward the southern end, somewhere around 158th to 160th Street. Very, very large co-op.
Mountaintop co-op.
Yeah, exactly. And these are all along the Hudson River. They kind of stand out. Another standout is what's known as the Pumpkin House, and that's along the Hudson River. It's a 1920s 17-foot wide 6-bedroom townhouse cantilevered from a 250-foot tall cliff above the Henry Hudson Parkway, and it's located at 16 Chittenden Avenue. And the windows form the look of a pumpkin from the Hudson at night with an orange hue.
That's cool.
So yeah, it's obviously been known as the Pumpkin House. So definitely worth mentioning. I think it finally traded hands. It was on the market for a while, but yeah, I think it finally traded hands recently. Culture, and some of these we mentioned in kind of a bit in part one. You've got the Cloisters, which is owned by the Met, and famous museum within a park, mostly of medieval art and literature. We discussed that all in, a little bit of that in the previous episode, and we'll probably do like a whole episode on the Cloisters. There's the Hispanic Museum, which we've mentioned in a couple episodes, down by 155th Street, and that's actually right next to Boricua College and part of that whole complex. One thing that we didn't talk about was United Palace Theater, which is pretty awesome. It was one of Manhattan's largest and most spectacular theaters, built in 1930, and it was one of the Lowe's Wonder Theaters. As it was meant to be like one of those premier theaters, and it was built as a vaudeville and movie house, designed by Thomas Lamb, who designed so many of the movie houses and vaudeville theaters uptown in the day. It was one of, and I mentioned that these were mentioned, so these were meant to be like flagship type of locations. It was built by Lowe's as the Wonder Morton Theater with the Wonder Morton Theater organ pipes. These Lowe's spectacular movie theaters. The most famous one was the Ziegfeld Theater, but Lamb also designed most of the theaters in Upper Manhattan. Interiors were designed by Harold Rambusch, known for the Waldorf Astoria interiors and Radio City Music Hall. It was described by the New York Times, and I think you can't make this up, as the Byzantine, Romanesque, Hindu, Sino-Moorish, Persian, eclectic, Rococo deco, and a kitchen sink masterpiece. So, quite the interesting place. More than 3,000 seats, and it's the fourth largest venue of its kind in Manhattan.
I'm not sophisticated enough to even picture what that would mean.
Yeah, let's just say it's eclectic. I think is the easiest way to describe it, with all different architectural designs in it. There have been plenty of TV and movie shows over the years taking place over here. Quantico, Saturday Night Live, John Wick 3, Legos Rebuild the World with Billy Porter, and Luke Cage from Netflix. Lots of great music concerts have taken place there, and I'm not even going to begin to scratch the surface here, but just to name a few: John Legend, Lenny Kravitz, Bob Dylan, Adele, and just a whole host more. So this is one of the premier concert locations in New York City.
Love all those acts. On that note, Adam, I'm going to have to get going.
Yep. So, thank you so much for your contribution, and we'll go through the second half of this episode. But thank you very much for your contribution.
Thanks for allowing me to join.
All right, awesome. Thank you. And, finally, in terms of culture, we also have the Morris Jamel Museum Mansion. And this was the mansion we've discussed, the Haunted Mansion episode, but yeah, pretty awesome in and of itself. Other notable points, and we kind of discussed this in part one, to varying degrees. There's the George Washington Bridge is located, within Washington Heights, the Little Red Lighthouse, and of course then there's the High Bridge and the High Bridge Water Tower, the bridge itself and the water tower. The water tower itself is 200 feet tall, built in the style of medieval tower. There was originally a reservoir next to the water tower, which provided water to 90% of the area serviced, and the tower provided the additional 10% by creating additional pressure in the elevated structure. And it's worth noting that, this is where a large portion of New York City's fresh water, drinkable water, came from. The land from this The water tower was owned by Eliza Jamel, and frequent listeners will recognize her name as one of the owners of the Morris Jamel Mansion. Eliza tried to sell the land to the city at a discounted price to make the process smoother, but the city wanted an even larger discount. Ultimately, the city did get its lower price through eminent domain, something that is of consequence today, especially, if you talk about Upper Manhattan, and Columbia wound up obtaining a few parcels for their new Manhattanville campus via eminent domain. So controversial then and controversial now. They finally got it through eminent domain about 6 months after Elijah passed away. The tower is open to the public on occasion, and it is possible to climb to the top. I've done it. It's kind of cool because it's already near one of the highest natural points in Manhattan, and then you're getting the views from the top of the tower, and they're just absolutely spectacular. As we move forward into terms of other cultural aspects of Washington Heights, you have the Fort Washington Avenue Armory. It's a historic 5,000-seat arena. It's home to the nonprofit Armory Foundation, the National Track and Field Hall of Fame, and more recently, the Nike Track and Field Center and the Police Athletic League of New York City. It was home to the 22nd Regiment of the Army Corps of Engineers, and I know that it's been used to give licensing exams for various groups, architects, engineers, nurses, and I can just tell you from firsthand, there was a client that told me that they took their bar exam within the armory. I guess within circles of people that are in the track and field world, it's called the fastest track in the world, as more records have been set on the Armory's track than any other facility in the world. So that makes that quite interesting space. And the 22nd Regiment actually traces its origins to the Union Greys who stayed behind in Manhattan when the city's other units left for the Civil War. They helped suppress the New York City draft riots in 1863. So I don't know if everyone knew, but and I think this was probably exemplified in the movie The Gangs of New York. It goes back to that Civil War era, and you end up actually seeing the riots that and uprising that happened as a result of the draft in New York City. So, this was the group, they called this location home, that actually helped, quell those fires that were burning. The Armory building is visible behind the left field and across 168th Street in the photos of Hilltop Park, which was the original home of the New York Yankees. And yes, there's a restaurant bar called Hilltop Tavern, and obviously, they've got pictures of the original New York Yankees there. Now, what's really fascinating is my next point, is the former Harlem Speedway, and it was a former raceway, and it went from 155th Street up to Dyckman Street, the parkway that ran north and south along the west bank of the Harlem River, and was called the Harlem River Speedway. It opened in 1898. It was originally restricted to equestrians and carriage drivers, with bicyclists being excluded. That wouldn't stand today. But they were excluded for fear that sharing the road with other vehicles would ruin their good time, for the extreme wealthy that was trying to, exclude other groups, and that it would mar the horseman sport. Tourists could watch the horse and boat races from the Fort George amusement park and watch the scenery along the Harlem River. Now, that amusement park is pretty fascinating in of itself. I actually sent as a closing gift to one of my clients a picture, from that amusement park that existed. Also worth noting is the carousel from that amusement park, and this was like the Coney Island of its day. But that amusement park, actually, the carousel, survived over the many years, and I think it was right around the time that the Palisades Mall in Nyack, New York, had opened. They wound up moving that carousel into the mall, and I used to live not too far from there, but pretty fascinating that it wound up there. And I had no idea that that carousel, had such ties to, old New York City history. In the years that have followed, though, I know that it has, the carousel has moved somewhere into the, I believe it's the northwest of the country. I don't quite know what state it's in, but I believed it was moved, elsewhere to the other part of the country. But in 1919, the Harlem, going back to the Harlem Speedway, in 1919, it was open to motorists, and 3 years later, ultimately, it wound up getting paved over. And of course, Robert Moses in 1940, he envisioned that a highway could connect all of Manhattan's byways and driveways. And he finally got his way. In 1964, the Speedway and other projects were completed to connect each other, and the Speedway ultimately became the Harlem River Drive. Ultimately, and I had mentioned this, previously, but Washington Heights actually has the highest natural point in all of Manhattan. Of course, no other story could be complete without discussing the Polo Grounds. And, Polo Grounds start, around the 155th and go, for several blocks north going, on the, I guess, eastern portion of the neighborhood overlooking Cogan's Bluff. The Polo Grounds consisted of a total of 3 stadiums in Upper Manhattan used for baseball and football from the period of 1880 to around 1963. The original Polo Grounds opened actually a little earlier in 1876 and was demolished in 1889, and it was actually built for polo. Hence the name, but, most people did not know of the original iteration of it. In baseball, the original Polo Grounds was home to the New York Metropolitans from 1880 to 1885. The Giants played in the second Polo Grounds for part of the 1889 season and all of 1890, and then at the third and fourth Polo Grounds from 1891 to 1957. It was also home to the New York Yankees from 1913 to 1922, and the expansion of the New York Mets in their first 2 seasons, 1962-1963 era. But each of the 4 versions of the ballpark held at least one World Series. So, for me, a non-sports person, that's, I find that fascinating, and I'm sure sports people will probably find it even more fascinating. In football, the third Polo Grounds was home to the New York Brickley Giants for one game in 1921, and the New York Giants from 1925 to 1955. It was the New York Titans/Jets of the American Football League that played at the stadium from the league's inaugural season of 1960 to 1963. And then, in terms of like other sports, soccer, boxing, and Gaelic football had also been played there as well. And the final sporting event was a pro football game between the Jets and Buffalo Bills, December 14, 1963. And Chase Stadium opened in 1964, replacing the Polo Grounds as the home of the Mets and the Jets. I guess the final 2 aspects of mentioning that are worth mentioning for the neighborhood, Rucker Park. It's you had the Battlegrounds in Hamilton Heights, and Rucker Park is just a few blocks north. More than a dozen NBA players have developed their skills at Rucker Park prior to becoming notable in the sport. A few of the players included Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, who grew up near the Battlegrounds, Will Chamberlain, Julius Dr. J. Irving, Stephon Marbury, Earl Monroe, and Kevin Durant. Even a guy that knows a little, just very little about sports like me knows who these players are. So, obviously the influence of Rucker Park is world renowned. And then finally, you want to discuss over here the New York Presbyterian, Columbia University, Irving Medical Center, and we discussed them a little bit, when we're talking about, the 5 major schools of the Columbia Medical program. In terms of Washington Heights accessibility, you've got the one train, that goes all the way up and into the Bronx. You've got the A train to 207th and Inwood, and slightly north of the Washington Heights border, and you've got the C train that runs up to 168th Street. Finally, you've got subway access. The filming that was worth mentioning, and there's been a lot that's been filmed up in the area. Obviously, you have In the Heights, and that was written for the neighborhood and filmed in the neighborhood. You had Salt with I forgot her name, Angelina Jolie, who's climbing on the exterior of a building at 157th Street. The Deuce, Coogan's Bluff with Clint Eastwood, Boardwalk Empire. That scene was from Sylvan Terrace. But you've had various TV shows like Law and Order and SVU that have filmed in the area as well. Notable residents, and I'm sure I can go on and on, so I'm going to keep this brief, but Harry Belafonte, Stan Lee, Frankie Lyman, of course, Lin-Manuel Miranda. We discussed his shows and movies. Freddie Prinze, Manny Ramirez, Alex Rodriguez, Lou Gehrig. Obviously it makes sense that you've got all these sports stars, given the history of what I was discussing earlier. Cardi B, David Dinkins, Lawrence Fishburne, William Bill Shea, namesake of Shea Stadium, Citi Field, Alan Greenspan, Jacob K. Javits, who now has the major convention center in the Midtown area, named after him, Henry Kissinger, and Dr. Ruth Westheimer. And I can say, from the experience of a very close friend, Dr. Ruth is known for her hitchhiking skills, and my friend recognized her on the street as she was waiting for a red light, and she called out, "Dr. Ruth," and Dr. Ruth comes on over and asks her, "Are you going uptown?" And my friend's like, "Sure." She's like, and she's like, "Can I get in?" And and she does, and my friend winds up driving her home. So, awesome story of great New Yorker. If you remember her from the 1980s, she had, I believe it was on MTV, her own TV show, and very cool character. I've actually seen her at a lecture at NYU, and she's quite the character, but a lot of fun. But yeah, she's one of the notable, famous residents of the neighborhood, past and present, that I've discussed. But this gives you a nice general sense of understanding, a little bit more, of Washington Heights. Again, as with all the episodes, we're hoping that these encourage you to go up to the neighborhood, explore, and just enjoy the neighborhood, and get to understand what there is to see and do, and what excites us about these neighborhoods. So thank you for joining us again. This is Harlem Stories, and we hope you have a good one.